I'd say don't be afraid to speak up and advocate for yourself. Um, because if you're feeling it 9 times out, probably 10 times out of 10, it's probably happening.
So if you were to speak to a tenant from the Black and Global Majority community and they were having issues with their housing and facing discrimination when trying to rent somewhere, trying to buy somewhere, what 3 pieces of advice would you give them to try and navigate this issue?
Being in a long-term temporary accommodation, what it's done for a lot of adults is they've plateaued, and for that means that they're not living the actual life that they're meant to live.
I mean, it's a conversation I'm finding myself having quite a lot with, especially older members of our community, because they face the immediate racial discrimination, the colour bar in housing, where they weren't allowed to rent apartments in certain areas or houses in certain areas.
A white person still would have benefited so much from that. We're black. We're not monolithic. So how do they get those real tangible pointers to push this policy forward?
Welcome to Talking About Race, the podcast from Race on the Agenda. And we're really, really happy to be conducting this podcast live in person for the first time. I'm Kulvinder. I'm the Research and Policy Coordinator at ROTA, and I've been hosting this podcast since the start of the year. We're also really happy to have Leninna Ofori as our first live in-person guest. Leninna, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, of course. My name is Leninna Ofori, and I am a social entrepreneur. My focus is on making social impact through any work or any business that I'm building. I am the CEO of Principal Housing, which is supported accommodation in a nutshell. We support young people who are leaving care, 16 plus and 18 plus, to grow into amazing, wonderful individuals, despite things that they may have navigated. And I love that work. I'm also the founder of the Awareness Tap, which is a film, arts and social action research company. And on the can, we create story for systems change, but it's probably a lot deeper than that. We use qualitative research to make a bit of noise about things that are going on socially. And I'm an independent consultant as well. And all of my consultancy work is around catalysing funding for marginalised communities. It is undertaking large-scale programmes around qualitative research to also make systems change. Yeah. In a nutshell, that's what I do. I'm an author, I'm a mother, I'm a wife.
No, thank you. Super important work. And I'm really looking forward to kind of getting your perspectives on everything that we're going to be talking about today. And you're also a member of our Brick by Brick advisory group.
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Proud member. Sorry, I thought that.
So this is Brick by Brick is a year-long planning project that ROTA have been working on over the past year, trying to kind of use storytelling as a vehicle to drive narrative change around housing insecurity, housing inequalities. And so we're really glad to have you on board there.
Thank you.
Really glad to have you kind of in conversation with us today. Today we're obviously going to be talking about the impact of poor housing policy and poor housing in general on members of our communities across the country, and thinking about what we can actually do about it, what we can do to change these issues that we've been facing for such a long time. If you're happy, I'll kind of get straight in with some questions.
It's fine.
So for a bit of background, we've been in a housing crisis for longer than, I can remember. You can remember, most people can remember. But over the past kind of few years, especially since the cost of living crisis and stuff like that, do you feel like this has got noticeably worse?
I think it's become noticeably worse, but then I think we have to look at things through different perspectives. It's noticeably worse because we have amplification of things that are happening, because we have social media and we have probably a lot more organisations that are advocating. We have the fact we've got social media in itself, of course we're going to be able to see it a lot more, but it doesn't take away from the fact that some of our elders faced so many levels of deprivation and in regards to housing that actually we don't now. So I think it's really hard to kind of to do these big comparisons and make it seem like it is worse now. I think we're just seeing it, we're hearing about it more because there's so many mediums and platforms for us to hear and see. But what I would say is, whether it's better or worse, it's still terrible. And there isn't going to be, how can I put it, massive shifts while we've got the levels of disparity and discrimination that we have in this country. regardless of policy, which sounds really doom and gloom, but I just like to put it out there and be real. The things that our elders faced, sometimes people are like, oh, we're so lucky, we're so blessed, we don't have to go through that. Look at how much better our lives are, etc. But now it's because it's a lot more undercover because we've got certain laws in place. But the racism is still there, the inequity is still there, we can still feel it, still very tangible, it's still very spiritual and suppressive. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean that it's a conversation I'm finding myself having quite a lot with, especially older members of our community, because of course, they face the immediate racial discrimination, the colour bar in housing, where they weren't allowed to rent apartments in certain areas or houses in certain areas. So yeah, we don't have that.
We don't. We don't, but we do.
Yeah, exactly.
We could talk about that. I'm sure we will, but yeah.
So yeah, I mean, what do you think in the here and now? Obviously, it's illegal to not let a flat out to someone from the Black and global majority community now. But where do you see racism actually playing a part in the housing inequalities that we're facing at the moment?
Well, it's illegal, but there's lots of things that are illegal that are happening in this country. And I think, like, we know that Shelter done a piece of research of 2022. We had the BBC investigation. We know there's discrimination just based on race, and even if they can't see you, it's on the accent, was it? And also surname. So therefore, they're instantaneously, and they're things that you can't really hide. Race you can hide on the phone, but if they can hear your accent, and actually there's something about like this nuance that a lot of global majority feel is that no matter how poised you are or articulate, that people can feel the texture of the tone in your voice. You black. So that is there. That's a massive piece of discrimination, because if somebody has like the right kind of paperwork, they've got the job, they've got good credit score, etc., they still can be demonized because actually they got on the phone and they sounded like a black or brown person. Then if they're not on the phone but they're filling something out, then they've got their surname. And the proof is in the pudding. And that's what I love about storytelling, because actually it's such an expose about what's actually happening. No one can run from that BBC investigation because we saw it with our own eyes. And then with qualitative research, we've seen it through the crisis investigation. So even though you said it's illegal, and I'm glad that you put that out there, it's still happening because there's loopholes and people can say, oh no, the property wasn't available. But the person on the other line will be wondering, I wonder if it's because they know I'm black. And actually 9 times out of 10, it has been that rationale, or they filled something out. And then it goes wider, doesn't it? For the same kind of reasons, because if a black or brown person is going for a job and they're facing that same like level of discrimination based on just their surname and where they come from, then obviously then their earning power is not as great as their white counterparts. So therefore the discrimination is intersectionality. It's the intersectionality that we face is connected, and it is making it harder for people to rent in the areas they want to rent, or to have the size house that they want, etc. It's not always, I think a lot of people, when they think about renting, they always think about straight away about social housing, not realizing that people who are not looking for social housing are also facing discrimination as well. So yeah,
exactly. And that's before, I mean, you kind of touch on the idea of people being unable to rent or buy in the areas that they want to. I mean, we're recording this right now in Tottenham, right, which is an area which is undergoing a super...
Oh my God, the gentrification is real, because my book, Advocate, I talk a lot about the fact that I'm born and raised in Tottenham, right? I don't live in Tottenham now, but I moved out like over 20 years ago. But when I grew up in Tottenham, like here, it reminds me a little bit of Farringdon, like what they're trying to do around here. When I first came back to Tottenham, I was like, what is happening? Because I know that the fact that there's a lot of people who are still living here, and a lot of things that are being put in place here, like the eateries, etc., they're not places that a lot of people who are living here will be accessing. And actually, when they're doing all of these beautiful new builds, the rent is not an affordable price for the residents that already exist here. And then they are pushing them out to other areas that they don't know, and they also may not be welcomed. So it's really, really, like, the gentrification is very apparent in Tottenham. Like, the studio is gorgeous and there's nothing wrong with having it. We need places like this in Tottenham, but it's the factor of the accessibility of the things they're putting in places. Is there affordability? And usually the answer is no, and that's the reason for gentrification, right? Yeah. So, I mean, coming from this area and seeing, because I actually was doing some work in the youth club, not too far from here, and actually there's some pockets of Tottenham that haven't changed whatsoever, that need a bit of that energy not gentrification, but just like the revamps and the renovation and the money to be poured into. However, we know what the actual motives are. And I think a lot of people that don't live in certain areas that are being gentrified or do and are benefiting will make it seem like the people living within those areas have got a chip on their shoulder. However, if you only see things becoming better and you're not able to touch them, of course you're going to be offended, and you can feel that that's been done purposely, like, you know, it's been done intentionally.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like when we're talking about the unaffordable eateries, the bars,
Yeah,
the restaurants, what's being closed down
yeah,
to make space for
yeah.
those?
The affordable
Yeah,
things.
exactly.
They're like the smaller, the independently unfranchised run shops
Yeah.
that people got used to, which sold cultural foods that. Like Tottenham is so diverse, so of course, and a big part of like even Tottenham High Road and like Bruce Grove is just that accessibility of cultural food, and not even just that, just like kind of like the interactions of being able to see people who look like you and also people who don't, but you've all got that commonality of coming from this area and that nuance of understanding the grit of the area as well, because there's a grit here, right? So, which I think they're trying to get rid of. I'm not sure if it's possible, but.
Yeah, exactly. So when obviously families from Black and global majority communities are being kind of told they can't live or they can't afford to live where they grew up in areas like
Yeah.
Tottenham, and they're being moved out to other areas, what
Yeah.
kind of effect does this have on people's cultural identity, people's kind of sense of well-being?
I think there's a massive disengagement for families, because when I moved out of London, I even used my own lived experience. I was 24 and I had 2 children, and I always talk about it 'cause now I've got 5 children, and I talk about the fact of being so far from my family and my culture, because when I moved out, like there wasn't lots of people that looked like me, or even people who understood my background or what I've experienced or my lived experience in Tottenham. And I felt like the fact that you don't have your family around you does really change your dynamic of you become very hyper independent. And actually that's not always a positive thing. It's quite a toxic trait. Like I realize that it's nice to have help. But the thing about Tottenham is community. So I think like areas like Tottenham where they're doing it, and also like parts of like Dalston, Hackney, Brixton, most of the people who've lived there have got like a legacy of living there. Like my grandma lived in Stamford Hill, then my mum lived like off Lordship Lane, so that's where I lived. And then when I first moved, I lived off White Hart Lane, so there was always this connection. So like dinners were close by if I needed help with the children, or there's like this family, like it's a beautiful kind of feeling and that connectivity that you have with family. And I think when people are being pushed out, obviously the powers that be don't think about the fact that someone might have a job and their mum helps, and culturally that's very normal that your child might be picked up by their grandmother or etc. And that's the way that people are saving money, and they don't connect all of those dots, and they don't see it as their role to. It's just the fact that they're pushing someone out. And I think that fragmentation is really dangerous for our culture, and I'm finding that we see it more, that families are far more fragmented than they were before. And I think that's a lot to do with money, people having to move out, people thinking about, which I don't know if we're going to touch on this, but also the schools that are in different areas, which is for another reason, because catchment areas, and I had a conversation on the way up here about people moving just to be in the catchment area, but the catchment area is so expensive, but the school in their area, which they can't actually afford, is terrible. And all of these type of things. So I feel like it's a real pull on people's mental health and also just community as a whole.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, you mentioned that, like, for example, some families from our communities might not have the assets to be able to move into a good catchment area. What other kind of barriers do you see there being for Black and global majority families, community members, when it comes to kind of speaking out for their rights in the housing sector?
I think it's twofold. I think firstly, I'm talking about the onus on ourselves as the global majority, that culturally we are usually raised not to check your business, and I'll say that's exactly how it was told. Like, don't check your business, don't talk about your business, don't talk about what you're going through. Actually, we keep things. That's what I said about hyper independence. That's like could be an individual thing or a family cultural thing, that we rely on each other. Like we're not going to help if there's an MP or there's a surgery being held in the community about your issue, the very issue you're facing. No, you're not. Why are you going there? Like, don't tell them that. Don't tell them this bit. And keeping pockets of like the situations to yourself. And I think that's a massive thing within our community, that actually some advocacy overall is positive. Obviously, some of it can go wrong, and if it's for the wrong reasons, it's just because of policy. Then obviously it's no point. However, I think a lot of Black and brown families don't take some support that is actually offered to them. I feel like I have understanding as to the reasons why. I think there's a lot of justified reasons as to why we wouldn't want to take support, because actually it's been convoluted before. There's been like hidden agendas, etc. However, I think our quietness, our silence sometimes really is to the detriment of our like next steps, our future, and what should be accessible for us. And I don't say that with judgment, because as I said, I spoke from my own experience. It took me a lot to begin sharing my journey, and I've actually documented it now. But I think that not everybody is going to do that, especially culturally. But the flip side, there isn't as much help for Black and brown communities as people say. I think there's a lot of stereotypes, and I think the assertions that a lot of the global majority may want to make may come with a lot of passion, because we've been discriminated for a lot of time. And I think because of the stereotypes that I hold about us in the community, within councils, and with a lot of policymakers as well, that generally, maybe not us or who are involved in policy, but are white people, the stereotypes that I hold that we quite aggressive, or we may be quite rude, and actually some people don't think that we are. No, they actually think that we sensationalize a lot of what's going on, and it's not that dramatic. And the last thing I think is that people deem us as very strong. So I feel that they don't even think that we need the support that we need. So when we flag something up, when we do finally go forward and say something, it's kind of maybe noted but not taken as seriously. And that could be the way that we relay it as well, depending. 'Cause it's a bit of an oxymoron. We can be very passionate, but also because of our level of resilience, I also feel that it can come across like we can normalize some of the stresses that we are actually engaged with. So yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so, I mean, you kind of mentioned it there, but when it comes to like policy and how policy works in this area, we know, of course, that discrimination on racial grounds in the housing sector is illegal, but it still does happen. What other kind of big areas do you think have a disconnect between what is said in policy and what actually happens on the ground?
I think policy is quite pretty. Because policy usually comes because of outrage. It doesn't just come, does it? I've never heard someone say, I'm just going to write a policy. You have to jump about a million hoops to even be permitted to, right? For it to be permissible. And even when it's written, even then there could be a lot of scrutiny. And I think like even we take like the renters' right and like the reform, that the work around that, like, yes, was exciting for anyone working in the housing sector that wants justice. However, the fact that there's nothing to do with discrimination in there is massive. I think it really does speak a lot to children, and obviously I work across children and young people services, so it's really powerful for that aspect. And the fact of like the no fault element of it, that actually you can't just be evicted, because that was happening quite a lot. And I think that Black and brown people were definitely at the higher rate of being evicted for no reason, or like a landlord just decides like next month I'll just be selling my house, and there's a family of like however many in that house, and they have to move on and not know where they're going. However, when you've missed out like massive things like discrimination, then it's almost like you've done a massive disservice. It is a public spend. That policy took a lot to be undertaken, and there's nothing about discrimination when that should have been like almost the biggest part of it, because the intersectionality is never really woven into policy, and the foundation of the policy in the beginning should have been the intersectionality, because then it would have been tackling so many different layers that even though yes the focus might have been race, a white person still would have benefited so much from that, because the intersections of disability, there could be sexuality, it could be education, English as a second language, etc., etc. But now there's no there's nothing to do with racial discrimination within it. I feel like there's a massive thing that's been missed. And I think that when we have policy, just generally, not just housing, and we don't look at intersectionality, I think there's it's a gap. And all of this thing is like delay. Delay, like, basically gives us delay reduces impact. So I know that for a fact that when it's finally is passed, it will be flagged instantaneously by the great people who do the great work, that racial discrimination is not a big factor within it. But then because it wasn't done initially, it dilutes the impact. That sound makes me sound like a bit of a sport brat, but it isn't that fact. Delay does reduce impact for sure. And I think that that's where I'm seeing like some of the policy issues. We get policies and then we fight and we argue and we say, oh, you haven't taken into consideration a black woman's perspective or a black man's perspective or a brown man or an Asian man, etc., whatever else. And we say it and then like they're like, oh, yeah, okay, because everybody's going on about it. But then by then we've moved on to another piece of like injustice that we're fighting because it's continuous, isn't it? And it's perpetual. It goes round and round. So yeah. Hopefully I'll answer that question. But.
No, exactly. So that was the Renters' Rights Bill, largely, which is kind of making its final stages through Parliament kind of right now, and should be in law within the next few weeks. But yeah, it was super disappointing to not have racial discrimination, to say the least, featured on the bill.
And other things.
Yeah, exactly, among other things.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's true. So if you were to speak to a tenant from the Black and Global majority community and they were having issues with their housing and facing discrimination when trying to rent somewhere, trying to buy somewhere, what three pieces of advice would you give them to try and navigate this issue?
I would say don't be afraid to speak up and advocate for yourself, because if you're feeling it 9 times out, probably 10 times out of 10, it's probably happening. To speak up to themselves and also like go to your local MP, go to the local authority and actually flag, especially if you're going to a private estate agent, flag that up, because actually the council does have a right to know what's happening with businesses that are trading in their local area. So that's a big thing. People don't like trouble and you need to actually bring that to them, because if they're doing something like that, you have to raise that concern. Secondly, I'd also bring it up with the people who are doing the discriminating, because I think the people that are doing it need to be told that you actually know. Give them that opportunity, I think. And if it is a local authority that you're dealing with and you're feeling it, it is to take advantage of advocacy that's out there through local organisations. There are so many, a plethora of them, that want to help in these instances. Yes, MPs also have surgeries in the community as well that you can see on the website, on the local authority websites. Ironically, they might be the ones oppressing you, but their surgeries are running within there. And you should go along. Don't be afraid to speak up. Sometimes as black and brown people, we try to stay silent and we all already feel that we're deemed as troublemakers. But actually, we have to be able to speak up for ourselves, for sure.
So when it comes to writing these policies, do you feel as though government are taking into account enough perspectives that are informed by lived experience?
No, with a big N, a capital N. And I say that there's loads of reasons for it. I think qualitative research is more expensive. So I know they don't come out and say that. But as an academic, I know, and as a researcher, I know, like, it's more expensive because you have to build relationships with people to hear their stories. No one really sits down and you're like, oh, tell me about yourself. And they just bring everything out to the forefront. So it's like relationship building. I think quantitative research, for want of better words, everything numbers, and like feedback forms, like the census, which I talk about all the time because I think it's actually hilarious. Because I know growing up, that census letter was dropping in the letterbox. Mum was like, put it in the drawer. Because who's got time? Yeah. And literally, that's still happening. All right, now you can go online and all the rest of it. But I think the quantitative research is very, very incorrect when it speaks about the global majority. It still calls us minority as well, of course, disrespectfully. And also, I don't know, like, if you're thinking about making change, you need to be speaking to the people that you're making the change for. That's why I love ethnography. That's why I love submerging myself into the situations to understand, because even though I've got nuance to a lot of the communities that I work within and the young people that I've even worked with through my housing company, I don't know their lived experience just because I may have lived in the same area as them or because we're both black. We're not monolithic. So how do they get those real tangible like pointers to like push this policy forward? So I don't think that they're thinking enough about lived experience. It's very buzzwordy at the moment. So they are talking about it, like we want to hear the lived experience. But how much of that do they want to hear? And in what ways and what spaces? And who are they sending to hear those stories as well? Because depending on the research on the other side, that's how much information they're going to get. And there's not many researchers who look like us. They are, but they don't always get the work. So I think there's lots and lots of layers, but definitely the answer is no. I don't think they're thinking about it enough or embedding it enough.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, yeah, it does. It is fair to say that qualitative research is expensive and
Yeah.
it takes time.
Yeah.
And when it comes to like turning around policies as quickly and as kind of headline grabbily as possible.
Headline grabbily is good.
Yeah,
I like
exactly. So when it comes to housing specifically, what aspects of lived experience from a racialized perspective do you think need to be considered more in policy and in solutions?
I think employment, we need to be thinking about employment because, for example, like if I have like a pseudo case study, I know somebody who has been temporary housed within a hotel or something. And for that, someone who's self-employed or somebody who needs like people to come to them, etc., and that's up in the air, that is affecting you massively. But because we already are being discriminated when it comes to business, self-employment, access like to investment in self-employment and entrepreneurship, and then also employment in itself, of course, these type of things are affecting us at a mammoth rate. That's why I keep on going back to intersectionality, because we're not only discriminated, if it's housing discrimination, there's so much of a discrimination already happening, right? And I think that when people, especially like the powers that be, and I just go down to like a lower level, like housing officers, for example, there's some great housing officers that we know, and they're jumping a lot of red tape. So it's not always the point that they're not housing people, it's just their fault. They don't have all the golden keys. However, what I've found is that the black families that I've ever engaged with that are having housing issues, it's affecting their livelihood, because in fact it's affecting their their mental health, and they're less likely to get support for mental health. They're less likely to be offered support for mental health because they're seen as resilient. So all of this is like domino ripple effect, isn't it? So it's not just employment, I think mental health. I also think the welfare of children and young people, especially when you're looking at like marginalized communities and marginalized areas where there's any level of deprivation and there's housing issues as well. Young people are more susceptible to child sexual exploitation, grooming, and people don't actually even realize like kind of the synergy and like the catalyst like housing has, and the fact that a safe home for a child is massive, or the space where they can actually take their friends back to. Because if your children can't come back to home with their friends, then they want to go to their friend's house. Everybody wants their house to be the house. That's how we are. We have children in our house all the time. We're happy to have kids come over because we know the kids and then we know they're safe. It's a bit biased, but that's just how it goes, right? But I say that to say this, that if your children aren't, then they are out with other people that you might not even know, because they don't want to come back home. And I think that when we look at housing as just like a very linear thing, like, oh, it's a housing issue, we kind of erase the fact of family dynamics, what home actually means. We're talking about housing, we're not talking about a home. And I think that we need to even bring the conversation back to that, like, oh, this person's got a housing issue. No, they haven't got a home, or their home has got an issue. And that's the place where like the world's outside is crazy. Like, let's face it, we go to work, you're stressed out, whatever else. And then you want to go back where home, put your feet up. It doesn't have to, it's not about bouginess here. It's about being comfortable, having a place that's safe, a place that hasn't got damp, a place that like is decent, maybe decorated to a decent standard. Like, people can work their way up to have all the niceties, but it's actually feeling safe and feeling comfortable. And I think every child deserves that, as well as adults. But I think people miss children from the picture. Like, if your parents got a housing issue, you've got a housing issue. And what does that mean for your homework, for your education, and just like your mental well-being as well? So there's so much more that's factored in, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's so important to consider that interconnectedness that is behind everything. I mean, especially educational outcomes.
Educational outcomes is massive, because young people that I've met that have thrived within education have been really happy at home. Even though some people have been happy at home, they just don't, some people are not academic, it's fine. But I've also found that the children who have had like, the hardest time at school have been those who are in temporary accommodation, or they looked after children, or there's some type of like destabilization within their home environment. And that's not to do with parents, that's to do with the actual house itself, if they're moving boroughs, etc. So yeah.
Yeah, no, of course. And I mean, I know you've worked across multiple fronts kind of
Yeah.
around issues with housing. Thinking about kind of lived experience and the stories that need to be put to the forefront, do you have any kind of specific kind of examples that illustrate these issues that we're talking
Yeah.
about here?
I'll talk about looked after children and like 16 plus, because obviously with 16 plus, when we've been working with young people, we've had like quite diverse young people. We've had unaccompanied asylum seeking young people. We've had British born, etc. So the point is that our teams are supporting them to when they're 18. We have 18 plus now, but at the time before we establish our 18 plus, they will be there 18, and then the council would want to move them on. So our team would be supporting them, to put their name on the housing register, etc. And what I found is that the support for the unaccompanied asylum seeking, like black young people versus the white young people, was so different. So even the for example, if you're looking at like Sudanese young people who've come, but they've got their stay. So it's not like they haven't got their stay at this point, right? And then the process is coming and like they're 18. The council's alerting us, they're going to be 18, they're going to be 18, they're going to be 18. Like, we're letting you know because it's going to end at this point. We're like, whoa, because we've had like British born that have overstayed a little bit, and we're like, oh, actually, because we've got 16-year-olds, we actually need them to move on, not because we don't want them to be there, but just because obviously at 18 is the cut-off point. But the urgency was never like that. The urgency was always, oh my God, don't worry, they're so happy here. Can you keep them an extra month? Can you keep them an extra this? We're going to find them a flat. But with these young black children we've seen, was like, as soon as they're 18, like, we're not paying. They need to leave. We found them a hostel. We found them this. And it was just like a different treatment. And I flagged it, like, because I'm a bit of a big mouth, so I will call it and say, like, I've seen differentiation, and people would say, no, definitely not, it's not discrimination, it's just at the moment we've got cuts or whatever else. But I've definitely seen it play out. And that's it, that's with children. Like, I don't believe 18-year-olds are fully fledged adults. I hate that. I hate that that's how it's seen. Yes, they're a bit more mature, but if they're looked after children as well, they've definitely experienced other layers and adverse childhood experiences, so they do need extra support, right? So to see that happening and playing out in housing when it's still linked to children and young people services has been quite wild. I think other things that need to be put to the forefront as well is the long-term temporary accommodation. This kind of instability that people within the local authorities are kind of really desensitized to. It happens when you work in certain sectors. I know that you can become desensitized, but I feel like when we have lived experience and qualitative research and like stories coming to the forefront and people being able to hear this, I think that takes away some of the desensitization, rather than when you see like, oh, 60% of black people, because we've been seeing those weird numbers and that disparity for years. Nobody's caring about a percentage. When you see a mother crying or when you hear that story, the emotion, not everybody will be hit by that, but it's quite emotive. It will kind of shift your psyche a little bit, unless you're a complete blooming Iron Maiden or something. But yeah, I mean, I think the stories of long-term temporary accommodation need to be pushed to the forefront, because what I have heard is that people just feel like they're on pause. So what it does is squash people's ambition. They're not making decisions about like their normal life, like how we would be going about it, because they don't know when they will be moved, and they're not even sure where they'll be moved. Because what I found as well, I've been speaking to a lot of people, and it's very weird, because the deeper that I've got into anything to do with housing, I've been encountering more people, obviously, that I known that I actually have faced things. And I think that being in a long-term temporary accommodation, what it's done for a lot of adults is they've plateaued. And for that means that they actually they're not living the actual life that they're meant to live. And I feel like we need to hear those stories. We need to be hearing that if you've been in an area for 3 years, but really you've been placed there temporarily while they're fixing an issue in your property and it hasn't been fixed, and you're meant to go back to your area, which is like 45 minutes away, you've begun to build like a new life in this area, but not the life that you actually are meant to be having. And I think that we're not thinking about that. Like, maybe we are, but the wider community, because it's a we thing, really, isn't it? The wider community, policymakers, the councils and the government don't think about the effects these things have on people, because it's not happening to them.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, one thing that you touched on there, which I find really interesting, we have spoken about a little bit, is the power of storytelling when it
Mm,
comes to policy and making change in these
mm.
areas. How do you think we would be best placed to like integrate storytelling more into the work that we're doing around housing?
I mean, not to be too researchery, but we need feasibility. Like, we need to have really strong feasibility reports. I know that's all budget as well, but you know that they don't do anything unless there's proof that it works or that it's needed. So I think that when organizations are looking at like policy reform around housing, but anything as well, just make sure that you are doing really deep dives and making sure you've got the strongest feasibility reports ever, because there is research and there is proof. So like, as much as we want to do our first hand research, we can do a lot of desk research. There's secondary research that can be undertaken to prove that qualitative research actually matters. I think with storytelling, obviously I'm biased as a storyteller, that there's power in words, but also stories are what are changing the world. So the discrimination that's taking place in this country is all stemmed from stories. Black people are like this, brown people are like this, etc. They're all stories that have been told for generations, and then have caused people to have certain levels of prejudice based on stories. There's nothing else, is it? It's all stories. So we have to almost, to counter that, we need a counter narrative, and we need to be telling the stories to kind of at the same level. Deep has to meet deep. The media has perpetuated a lot. So therefore, oh, black people, they want a free ride, or they want houses, and the same thing with like immigrants, that they want a house and all the rest of it. When actually the statistics are showing that a lot of immigrants are harder working than British-born people. So it's very, very crazy that. But this is all stories, and whoever's got the biggest platform obviously wins. So when we're talking about putting qualitative research within policy, we need to actually be able to prove that the truth being outed is actually how we're going to be able to build the new systems. The only reason why I kind of have a little bit of this question has got me on the fence a little bit is because the system is flawed, I believe, intentionally. So qualitative research isn't always pushed to the forefront because it is going to be the counter narrative, and things will get shifted. And if things get shifted across anywhere, housing, healthcare, etc., then a lot of people will be out of jobs. And I don't think they want that. But to be in an idealistic, more romanticist, I feel like to be able to push qualitative research and to get people to accept it, you need to prove that it works. And I think that every law and piece of reform that we've had for black and brown people, sadly, has been off the back of something major happening. Like when we had Stephen Lawrence, God rest his soul, and all the work that his parents had to do, it took 6 years for that Macpherson report to come out. But if he never died, it's so crazy to think that somebody had to die for us to get the Macpherson report. Is it George Floyd had passed away, and then we got like all these mass DEI, people running around everywhere trying to like fix their organizations. But that was another black man who had to pass away. And then Awab's law that will be passed, I think, was it 27th of October? Sadly, is because a young boy passed away due to the levels of damp and mold in his house that his parents had been reiterating to the landlord for ages. So we're seeing that those are stories. Like Stephen Lawrence's parents had to tell his story over and over and over again, and their story of their pain. The same thing with George Floyd. His story had to be told over and over again. We had to see it for people to be like, oh my God, we better fix our companies. And with Awab's law, like the parents have had to go out and advocate for themselves and for their son that they've lost for us to get that new law. But that shows you that the story works. That's your feasibility right there. I've just done it. I've done it. Yeah, there's some pointers there for anybody who wants to take them. But no, on a serious note, hasn't it been stories that have caused us to like get the changes that we want? Painfully, that we have to tell those stories, but qualitative research, we keep on calling it qualitative, but for the people who watch this, it is storytelling. It is truth being told for once. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it is a shame, to me at least, that all of those examples that you gave, which are very good examples about the power that stories have, they're all traumatic. They're
awful.
Yeah, they're all horrible,
they're about loss.
Traumatic events about loss in our communities, which have made members of our community feel scared, feel discriminated against. And yeah, so I just wonder, where is there a space? Is there a space for more positive storytelling that could still move the dial a bit in terms of policy and in terms of public perceptions? Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I think that when there's happy endings, there is. And that's that's a deep question. I mean, would I have to ask myself this question very, very carefully, because would I have written a book or had an opportunity to write a book if my life hadn't changed so much? No. So there are spaces, but I feel like there are also spaces that feel quite privileged. Do you get what I mean? Because even in like writing a book, publishing has got discrimination. So I'm very blessed to be one of the few Black British authors. Do you get what I mean? There are Black British authors, but not as many as white British authors. So I think when we think about putting things on a major platform, we are also going to have to do the work ourselves to hear the positive stories. It is about people who have had change coming forward, leading by example and telling their stories. And a lot of people don't want to return, and because it is traumatic to talk about what you had to pass through to get to where you are. That's trauma in itself. Sometimes just rehashing that, because anyone with lived experience knows that the healing is a proper journey. It doesn't happen overnight. But I think there's spaces and there's forums for it. For example, like podcasts like this. Like I do think that we can overcome some of the discrimination in housing. So this is a space to also hear positive things as well. I think podcasts. I think people having channels and like YouTube channels and Instagram. But I also feel like organizations like ROTA and other people who do great work around race equality do have like that responsibility, and that's what's happening, to bring those positive stories as well. Because I think a lot of qualitative research is used for activism, to like, we want change now, but actually not about like, look what happens when you do step 1, 2, and 3. And I think that it's an organizational thing. It could also be a media responsibility as well. So channels that are dedicated, I think, to putting out like stories for Black people need to really be careful about what they are putting out, because we've got a lot of crap, I think, as well, more than we've got good. And I think there's a responsibility there for us to be sharing those positive stories.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I can't think of a better note to end this kind of this podcast episode on. So thanks everyone for joining us for this first in-person recording. We hope to do many, many more of these over the next few months. So please do keep an eye out. In the meantime, do buy Lennina's book to learn some more about her amazing work and life. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.